Welcome to the second webinar from Homelessness New South Wales on specialist homelessness services providing assertive outreach to people who are rough sleeping. The first webinar looked at applying the Assertive Outreach Good Practice Guidelines to your service. That webinar, number 1 webinar, is still available on the Homelessness New South Wales website, as is the Assertive Outreach Good Practice Guidelines booklet and its resource material. Dougie Wells is with us and he's going to speak to a little overview of today's webinar.
Thanks, Chair. This webinar will take a broad overview of the steps required for taking a shared response to tackling rough sleeping between SHSs and mainstream services.
Great. So what's the agenda for the webinar?
As you'll see on this slide, this is the ground we will cover in this webinar. First, we will look at the objective. We'll have a short recap of webinar 1, and then we'll look at why services should consider initiating a shared response, where the backing for such an initiative comes from, the steps to take, and then to implementation. What the webinar does not do is advise at what level of shared response your initiative should be. There are many types of collaboration, so that is a decision you will need to make with your partners, according to the extent of rough sleeping in your locality, along with other factors.
Okay, so now in a bit more detail, the objective of this webinar is?
The objective of this webinar is to empower SHSs to initiate a shared response to address rough sleeping more effectively. So, as intimated earlier, this webinar is not about providing a shared response to rough sleeping. It's about initiating such a response and where your authority comes from to do so. Consequently, as it says on the slide, the objective of this webinar seeks to empower SHSs to initiate that shared response to tackling rough sleeping and the foundations upon which it can be built.
Okay, so before we jump in, let's hear a recap of webinar 1.
These were the issues that webinar 1 focused on. Assertive outreach and tackling rough sleeping is a complex and challenging area, too wide for one service to address on their own. A range of interventions are required for different cohorts and need to be linked to housing and healthcare networks. And we also looked at the 8 core characteristics of assertive outreach. These were the issues that webinar 1 focused on and are directly related to why SHSs should consider taking a shared response to tackling rough sleeping, given rough sleeping and associated issues are often so complex that a shared approach is required. In terms of the core characteristics of assertive outreach, as identified in the Ahuri paper, what role does assertive outreach play in ending homelessness for people who are rough sleeping? One of those characteristics was services taking a collaborative approach.
So, why take a shared approach?
That's the question we hope to answer in this part of the slide. The theory of collaboration states that if your agency has all the required specialist skills, knowledge and resources to tackle a complex problem, consider doing this alone. However, rough sleeping is certainly a complex problem and one which would benefit from a shared approach given the right circumstances. So what we have in these 7 dot points are some of the main reasons and potential benefits of taking a shared approach. Obviously, as we've said, the problem is a deep-rooted and complex one beyond the scope of one agency acting alone. It can bridge organisational boundaries that need to be bridged. Rough sleepers frequently experience health and social problems requiring a holistic response, and a shared approach may also result in some innovative practice. It can also create a durable and supportive network for the client, and tackling rough sleeping move from sole to shared responsibility. And what we mean by that is it makes the shift from SHSs having sole responsibility for tackling rough sleeping to tackling rough sleeping becoming a shared one between SHSs and other mainstream agencies. Where your authority to try and make that shift comes from is something we will explore in the next 2 slides.
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth. Where does your authority come from when taking a shared approach?
Well, in this section, we look at where the authority comes from SHSs to initiate a shared response to tackle rough sleeping. To inform the development of a template for a shared response, services will need to do some prior groundwork to test the readiness and willingness of potential partners to make the shift from sole to shared responsibility to tackle rough sleeping. As far back as 2008, as we can see on the screen, the then federal government's The Road Home White Paper on Reducing Homelessness, it was acknowledged in that paper that rough sleeping was too complex an issue to be resolved by one agency acting alone. That white paper is laced with statements providing authority to begin initiating a shared response to rough sleeping. As you will see from this selection of quotes from the white paper, and which speak for themselves on the need for urgency and for the responsibility to be a shared one. Likewise, the more recent Foundations for Change Homelessness in New South Wales, which is a consultation paper produced by the New South Wales State Government in 2016, that paper also recognised the limitations of services working alone to tackle homelessness, and that ideas are needed to find a more effective way to tackle homelessness. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the first three of the following quotes. And of those three quotes, the third one, use data to improve services, is something that we'll elaborate on as the webinar continues. Your authority also lies with the policies and statements made by a range of potential partners which may be providing services in your locality, as this slide demonstrates. Given the complexity of needs demonstrated by people who are rough sleeping, this suggests you will need to research the strategic plans and partnership policies on social inclusion from relevant agencies and services operating locally. Those plans, policies and statements provide a way into discussing with them their need to be involved in a shared response. It also holds those agencies and services accountable to their responsibility. And in the next slide, we will look at what data and research will be useful in bringing potential partners to the table. This short video from the National Alliance to End Homelessness, who are based in the United States, provides a brief but accurate overview of what a shared response to tackle homelessness can look like, and it aligns with the issues that are raised in this webinar. As you will have noted from that short video, data and research play a crucial role in making the case for a change of approach to tackling rough sleeping. And the aim of data and research is to mobilise services to act together. As we'll see from this slide, the purpose of conducting data and research is to mobilise services by creating a sense of urgency for a new approach to tackle rough sleeping locally. The more local the data is, the better. And here we have some tools and sources of data which will be useful to you. Data can assist in determining whether a change in approach is required by identifying the extent of rough sleeping locally by conducting a street count, the needs of those who are rough sleeping, their health, housing and legal needs, from the use of the Vulnerability Index or other assessment tool, the availability or lack of availability of services which can meet those needs, what responsibilities they have towards rough sleepers, and what useful data they may collect. You also need to look at what resources are required to meet those needs and the availability of those resources. There are some things to consider when collecting data. Street counts are one way of estimating the extent of rough sleeping locally and the characteristics of that cohort. Homelessness New South Wales can recommend some good links for services considering doing a street count themselves. In terms of the Vulnerability Index or similar tool, there is a potential dilemma for services looking at adopting such an assessment tool. Those dilemmas can be summed up as in, should assessment tools be tailored to the services that local providers can actually offer? If data is collected on a need that cannot be met by local services, how might this affect the credibility of local homelessness services with their target client group? But alternatively, the use of such an assessment tool as the VI may be crucial in making the shift from sole to shared responsibility, where it reveals a range of needs beyond the scope of an SHS. And obviously one major source of data on homelessness will be the ABS 2016 census, which we expect to be available in late February 2018. So what research would an SHS need to conduct if it's interested in shifting from sole to shared responsibility? First of all, you would want to identify who are your local potential partners. What role and responsibilities do they have with rough sleepers? What role could they take in a shared approach? But in addition to identifying who your local partners may be, it is suggested you also review the level of coordination, communication, and cooperation that currently exists between local services. Other research data that would be useful would be the healthcare costs of rough sleepers compared with that of the general population. Higher healthcare costs are incurred by those with long periods of rough sleeping. However, Australian research found that men provided with accommodation, support, and access to specialist support services decreased their use of Commonwealth and state health systems at an estimated annual saving of over $8,000 per person. Other research to conduct could be around the extent to which rough sleepers are registered with a local GP or health centre, what local agencies' community strategic plans, partnership, inclusion policies and responsibilities towards people who are homeless. Do these policies exist in isolation from each other? Do they facilitate a coordinated approach to rough sleeping? Are two of the questions you may want to ask when you're looking at those agencies' policies and partnership policies. You could also look at local housing providers' knowledge and awareness of the application of Housing First. Do they realise it's most appropriately applied with the most vulnerable of rough sleepers rather than all of rough sleepers? A lack of awareness of the Housing First model may be a source of unintended resistance from housing providers. You may also want to look at the health needs of homeless people, and are they being included in the planning and commissioning of healthcare services by your local health department. And finally, the housing histories of people who are rough sleeping locally. This would be especially important to know, especially where you need to show that post-crisis support is important to assist clients avoid cyclical homelessness. I need to point out that this list is only a selection of the research questions you will need to ask, and it is of course important to first determine what you need to know, as this will make your research easier.
So now we've discussed the research and data, let's talk about how you might engage your local partner services.
How does local data and research inform the look of a local shared response? Use the data and research in your engagement with local agencies and have a clear set of asks and wants of them, with clearly defined roles and responsibilities of potential partners as part of the shared response developed prior to engagement. Data and research that is backed up with case studies will be more powerful, and you should consider presenting data in a user-friendly way for use by those you'll be engaging with. And user-friendly ways would include graphs or other visual indicators of what your research has found. Remember, engagement takes time and is an integral part of developing a common agenda. And be prepared to adapt your thinking as you go along. So following on from that previous slide on engagement, we now look at common understanding and developing a shared vision for change. If you want to create change, one of the first steps is to collect data and use it strategically with potential partners as outlined earlier. In terms of number 1 on the slide here, a sense of urgency for changing the way local services tackle rough sleeping, you would need to identify the purpose of the shared action. What is the end result that you want? Because this can be engaging and energizing, not just for the engagement process, but for potential partners to see where their part in the shared response lies. Developing purpose can also provide clarity and strategic direction. And as the homelessness sector is a values-driven sector, it would be important to identify the values of a shared approach, because values drive purpose. Obviously, you would need to ensure the values are shared and they are meaning agreed between potential and partners. And you would also need to identify in your local area what is currently working and what is not working in tackling rough sleeping. Another way of saying this is to gang up on the problem, not on each other, not with your potential partners. And 4, agreement to take joint action through agreed actions is basically saying to set strategic goals that will enable you to move forward.
So what resources are required?
In this slide, we look at what type of shared response is needed and what resources would be required to be the most effective, depending on what type of shared response you and your partners are going to develop. So, in terms of what resources are required, use the data and research to identify what resources are required to meet the stated purpose. A long wish list may only prove to be a diversion from the purpose. And remember, resources can be interpreted widely to include equipment, staff, expertise, knowledge, and so on. Which local agencies might have these resources? It's important to include the idea of backbone support resources if the shared response is to be embedded in joint service operations, because those actions will need to be communicated and coordinated, and data will need to be collected, shared, and protected. So which agency may be the most appropriate to fulfill that responsibility and role as backbone support? And what of the timeline? Is the shared response going to happen for one-off actions only, or be held on a regular basis, or would it be more embedded into local services' day-to-day operations? So clearly you'd need to decide on a timeline for the shared response and include regular review periods to monitor issues and progress.
What types of challenges and resistance might services encounter, do you predict, Dougie?
The following dot points are some of the challenges and resistance you are likely to encounter. And I think it's fair to say that challenge and resistance are likely to be a continuous feature of developing a shared response, from trying to interest others to collaborate, as well as how a shared response will actually operate locally. This is one reason why having a clear purpose and having a set of agreed values to work from at the start is important. Other challenges and resistance may be keeping partners involved in the shared action and building trust, and sharing control of the shared response. Some challenges may be based on practical things, the capacity of potential partners to take part, for example. Resistance may be more attitudinal, the what's in it for me principle. But as a rule of thumb, challenge and resistance can be overcome by the services taking part in the change rather than being subjected to it.
So who might be the potential partners?
On the slide here, we have a list of the most obvious and relevant partners in a shared response to rough sleeping. and it aligns with the core characteristics of assertive outreach. In looking at these potential partners, you would need to ask what role and responsibilities would such potential partners have in a shared response, and what specialist assistance may be available. For instance, from the local health district, does it have an assertive outreach mental health team? Obviously, housing partners would be a crucial part of a shared response, especially given that housing is often seen as the foundation of community care. But other potential partners may not always be so obvious, such as the police and local councils. So it's a good idea to have a wide idea of who your potential partners might be, to cast your net widely.
Right. So we've collected the data, you've done the research, you've got your local agencies on side. What next?
Okay. For implementing a shared approach, let's look at these step by step. The leadership group, working from left to right, leadership group should be cross-sectoral leaders of those involved in the shared response, who have the authority to make change, and having local funders relevant to rough sleeping on the group may also be useful. Obviously, one of the tasks of the leadership group would be to develop a governance structure and communication system for partners so that the system works well. Measuring progress is an important part of a shared response. So you need to determine what data will be collected, how and by whom, and how progress will be measured. The use of client data is very important too. You would need to decide on how client data will be collected, shared, and protected. In terms of the type of shared response, over what kind of timeline would that shared response operate? And the leadership group would also need to look at what support is required for governance and operational functions of the type of response that you are initiating. Finally, the participant roles. Ensure all participants are aware of their role and responsibilities in the shared response and have the capacity to take up those responsibilities and that role. And obviously, the leadership group needs to meet on a regular basis to monitor progress, adapt where required, and to celebrate and communicate wins.
A little session summary might be in order, I think.
The session summary, we've looked at the issues involved in initiating a shared response to tackling rough sleeping. We have seen that the issue of rough sleeping is often too complex for one service to tackle on its own, and that taking a shared response can often bridge organisational boundaries and helps shift taking the responsibility for rough sleeping from SHSs to one that is shared between SHSs and appropriate local agencies. As we've seen from the documents provided by the then federal government and the current New South Wales government, a shared approach is widely recognised by them as being effective. But for that approach to be effective, a common vision amongst partners is crucial because this will bind the shared response together. The use of data and research also has a crucial role to play because it can often mobilise services to act together, especially where there is a sense of urgency on the issue around rough sleeping. And finally, developing a shared response presents challenges, but it also presents opportunities. So, services wishing to initiate a shared response should look at what type of shared response is possible in your area, what resources and structures will it need to be effective, and finally, what would happen if you did nothing. That concludes this webinar on taking a shared approach to rough sleeping, and we now have some source material and further reading for you. The source material and further reading is pretty much what this session was based on, and each of these links is recommended that you have a look at if you are looking at taking on a shared response. If you have any questions or requests for further information on this webinar, please contact me. That's Dougie Wells, Senior Project Officer at Homelessness New South Wales. And there's my contact details below. Thanks for listening and good luck.
Thank you.